If names like Maverick, Torino, LTD, Thunderbird, and Granada instantly bring back a driveway, a parking lot, a family trip, or maybe a car you haven't thought about in 40 years, this one's for you. Because Ford didn't build these things as future collector cars. It built them to work, commute, cruise, haul families around, and eventually become somebody's cheap used car. Americans bought them in enormous numbers, and for years they seemed to be everywhere. Yet somewhere between then and now, most of them quietly vanished, while Mustangs and other Ford legends kept getting all the attention. So, today, we're going back to 5 forgotten Fords that once ruled American roads. Welcome to Motor Memento, the channel where we go looking for the cars America bought by the millions and then somehow talked itself out of remembering. So if that sounds like your kind of trip, stick around and consider hitting subscribe. At number 5, we have the Ford Granada. It arrived in 1975 with a very specific promise. You didn't need to spend Mercedes money to feel like you were driving something that looked the part. Ford leaned into that comparison hard in its advertising, placing the Granada right alongside European luxury sedans and letting buyers draw their own conclusions about the resemblance. It was a bold pitch for a car built on fairly ordinary American mechanicals underneath, and people bought it. Not cautiously either. The Granada moved past 300,000 units in its first year on sale, then climbed to more than 500,000 the following year. That's not a niche success. That's a car that ended up parked outside offices, churches, and grocery stores, in numbers most manufacturers only dream about. Buyers could get it with a simple inline-6 for those who just wanted reliable, inexpensive transportation, or step up to a V8 if they wanted a little more presence under the hood. Either way, what they were really buying was the feeling of moving up a rung, even on a middle-class budget. That's what made it work. So why does almost nobody bring up the Granada today? Partly because that's exactly what happened to it. A car purchased as an aspirational statement in 1976 was, by the mid-80s, just a cheap used sedan with a vinyl roof and 100,000 miles on it. Nobody was setting one aside for the future. They were driving it until it wasn't worth fixing anymore. At number 4, we have the Ford LTD. This one isn't about aspiration, it's about size. Real, physical, take up 2 parking spaces size. The 70s LTD, especially in Brokum trim, belonged to an era when comfort meant isolation from the road entirely. Soft suspension, a wide bench seat, a hood that seemed to stretch out ahead of you longer than some driveways. Families didn't just own these cars. They lived inside them for hours at a time. Long highway drives, vacations measured in states rather than miles, 3 kids across the back seat with room to spare. The LTD was built around the idea that comfort should come first, and everything else could work around that. And Ford sold an enormous number of them. In its strongest years, LTD production pushed toward 500,000 units annually, which puts it in the same conversation as some of the best-selling cars in America at the time. Full stop, not just among Fords. That's the part people forget. This wasn't a footnote model. This was mainstream America's default full-size car for a stretch of the 70s. So why doesn't it get talked about now? Because everything glamorous in Ford's lineup ended up somewhere else. The Mustang kept its performance reputation. The Thunderbird held on to its personal luxury identity. Lincoln had the actual prestige badge. The LTD was just the big, comfortable, extremely common Ford, and cars that everybody's parents owned rarely get remembered as anything special, even when, statistically, almost everybody's parents really did own one. Before we move on, if you're the kind of person whose family had one of these in the driveway, drop a comment about it. And if you're enjoying digging through these forgotten Fords with us, this is a good moment to subscribe, because there's a lot more of this kind of automotive archaeology coming. At number 3, we have the Ford Thunderbird. Most people's mental image of the Thunderbird's best years lives somewhere in the late 50s or the 60s. Ask an enthusiast to name the Thunderbird's sales peak, and you'll likely hear a guess from that earlier era. It's a reasonable guess. It's also wrong. For 1977, Ford completely repositioned the Thunderbird. It came down substantially in price from the generation before it, and in doing so, it stopped being a stretch purchase and became something a much wider slice of America could actually afford. The car kept the formal roofline, the long hood, the vinyl top, the opera windows, all the visual language of personal luxury. But now it was priced for the masses rather than the few. The result was staggering. Ford sold around 318,000 Thunderbirds in 1977 alone. The following year, that number climbed past 350,000. Add the third year of that generation, and you're looking at close to 1 million Thunderbirds sold across just 3 model years, the strongest sales stretch in the nameplate's entire history. Sit with that for a second, because it's a genuine reversal of what most people assume. The Thunderbird generation that enthusiasts talk about least is the one that ordinary Americans bought in the greatest numbers by far. Personal luxury, it turned out, wasn't about performance or exclusivity. It was about looking substantial while riding in comfort, and Ford figured out exactly how to sell that feeling on a mass scale. It just didn't leave much of a legacy in enthusiast circles, because a car built around comfort and appearance rather than outright performance rarely gets the same second look decades later. At number 2, we have the Ford Gran Torino. Out of everything on this list, the Torino is the one that still gets some respect. Ford enthusiasts know the name. Pop culture kept it alive in ways the other 4 never got, and we'll come back to that. But the real story here is bigger than a striped paint job, and it's easy to lose that under the pop culture noise. In 1972, Ford completely redesigned the Torino line, and the result was a serious intermediate contender at a moment when that segment of the market was fiercely competitive. Ford wasn't just participating against Chevrolet's Chevelle. In this stretch, the Torino family was genuinely capable of matching or outselling it, moving somewhere around 500,000 units across the lineup. That's not a car playing catch-up. That's a car going toe-to-toe with the segment leader and sometimes winning. The Gran Torino Sport gave buyers a genuinely aggressive option, with a 351 available for those who wanted real performance rather than just the look of it. But this was also the exact moment the American car industry was changing underneath everyone's feet. Insurance costs climbing, emissions rules tightening, buyer priorities starting to drift from muscle toward comfort. The Torino sat right at that pivot point, part muscle-era holdover, part preview of where Ford was headed next. Then there's the cultural footprint. A famous 70s television detective show helped cement a very specific Torino image in the public imagination, one that later movies leaned on again. That's part of why the name survived in conversation better than Granada or LTD ever did. But that pop culture memory tends to crowd out the actual history, the fact that this was a serious, high-volume competitor to the Chevelle, not just a car with a recognizable stripe. So here's the twist with this one. It looks like the least forgotten car on this list, and in a narrow sense, it is. People know the name. What's been lost is the scale of what it actually accomplished against the segment's toughest competition. And speaking of scale, wait until you hear what's coming at number 1, because everything we've covered so far is about to look modest by comparison. At number 1, we have the Ford Maverick. If every car on this list makes the case that popularity doesn't guarantee memory, the Maverick makes that case louder than any of them. Ford launched it as almost defiantly simple. No pretense of European sophistication, no personal luxury styling cues, just straightforward, inexpensive American transportation with a starting price around $1,995. It was aimed squarely at buyers who wanted reliable basics and nothing more, and for a lot of families, that was exactly the point. America responded immediately. Ford moved something in the neighborhood of 579,000 units during its extended introductory model year, a number that dwarfs almost everything we've talked about so far. Across its full production run, total North American Maverick output landed somewhere north of 2 million cars. 2 million. That's not a successful model. That's a car that briefly became part of the ordinary texture of American life, coast to coast. Most came with a simple 6-cylinder engine, built for economy and easy upkeep rather than excitement. A V8 arrived later for buyers who wanted a bit more, and the grabber package gave the Maverick its one real flash of visual personality: stripes, spoilers, a bit of attitude layered onto an otherwise humble little car. And that humility is exactly why it disappeared. A Maverick wasn't purchased to be preserved. It was purchased to be used, driven to work, handed down to a teenager as a first car, run through Midwestern winters on salted roads, patched up as long as patching made financial sense, and then quietly scrapped once it didn't. 2 million cars built, and yet, decades later, survivors are far scarcer than that number would suggest, because nobody was setting Mavericks aside in barns the way they were with Mustangs. That's the whole thesis of this video, distilled into one car. The Maverick wasn't the best Ford ever built, and it doesn't need to be. It's simply the clearest example of a car that went from massive, everyday American visibility to almost complete disappearance from the cultural conversation, not because it failed, but because it succeeded so completely at being ordinary. So here's where all 5 of these Fords actually connect. Granada, LTD, Thunderbird, Torino, Maverick. Different sizes, different price points, different reasons people bought them, but the same eventual fate. They were built to be used, not preserved. Mustangs and Shelbys, and the genuine performance icons, had people rooting for their survival from day one. These 5 didn't have that advantage. They were simply expected to keep running until something newer came along to replace them in the driveway, and once that happened, most of them were gone for good. Massive sales numbers, it turns out, don't guarantee a lasting place in memory. Sometimes the opposite is true. The more common a car once was, the easier it became to overlook once it wasn't common anymore. So now it's your turn. Which of these 5 hit closest to home for you, and is there a forgotten Ford we didn't cover here that you think deserves a spot on this list? Let us know in the comments. I have a feeling the arguments are going to be good. Until next time, this has been Motor Memento, where the cars America forgot are always worth one more look back.